Welcome to Rock Center Shorts. I'm Kristen Savell, Managing Director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford University. I'm very pleased to introduce today's guest. Marc Fagel is currently a lecturer at Stanford Law School. He spent nearly 30 years as a Bay Area securities litigator with a focus on SEC enforcement. From 2013 to 2019, Marc was a partner at Gibson, Dunn and co-chair of the firm's Securities Enforcement Practice Group, where his practice focused on representing public companies and their officers and directors in investigations by the SEC, the DOJ, and other state and federal regulatory authorities. Prior to joining Gibson Dunn, Marc spent over 15 years with the SEC's San Francisco regional office. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you, Kristen.
Today, we're going to talk about the DOJ's first criminal indictment for alleged insider trading of non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, which was announced on June 1st. So to start things off, can you briefly summarize the facts alleged in the indictment?
Sure. So the federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York indicted an individual who was previously working for a company called OpenSea, which I'm not an NFT user myself, but essentially was an online platform for reviewing and purchasing and selling NFTs. The allegation is that this former employee would have inside information on the sort of NFTs that might be prominently displayed on the platform. And before they would go live, he would purchase them himself and be able to sell them at a profit, which was essentially an insider trading theory.
Got it. So you mentioned insider trading. The DOJ press release announcing the indictment claims repeatedly that this case concerns insider trading in NFTs, but historically, insider trading involves trading of securities, which is not alleged here. So in your opinion, is this an insider trading case?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a bit of a play with words by the U.S. attorney, not to disparage them. I think that is a colorful hook. The theory is the same theory you would see in a traditional insider trading case. Basically, the allegation that this individual had non-public information from his employer that he used to then make a profit in the market. But it does not, you're correct, does not involve a security, or at least there's no allegation that the NFTs are securities. The SEC did not bring its own civil action. So, traditionally, most of us think of insider trading as involving securities. There were no allegations of securities involved in this matter.
So what were the charges in the indictment?
So it was essentially a wire fraud charge, which is not unusual. In my experience at the SEC and on the defense side, the Justice Department will often bring wire fraud charges, either standalone or alongside a securities fraud charge. But because they did not allege this to be a security, there was no securities fraud charge. It was just strictly wire fraud.
Right, and so that's something that I've been trying to understand really. Is this wire fraud charge notable? And as you mentioned, I know your background is securities enforcement, not white collar crime, but does it strike you as a stretch to apply the wire fraud statute to the facts of this case? Because it seems that a lot of the commentary I've been reading is really focusing on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, the novelty really is about it being an NFT. It's the first case about this sort of fraud in connection with an NFT. Whether there's novelty in having this wire fraud theory, if you step back, there is no law against insider trading. The SEC and the courts have developed insider trading under a very broad anti-fraud statute, which basically says if you steal information from someone who trusts you with that information and use it to trade, that's a form of securities fraud. So this isn't a radical leap. They just took the securities out of the equation, but it's the same underlying theory. So yes, it's a little unusual to see it phrased as insider trading when you're not talking about securities, but the underlying concept of stealing information, using that confidential information to sell something and make a personal profit unbeknownst to the person you're trading with, that's not terribly novel.
Mm-hmm. Do you see this indictment as an intentional effort to sidestep the question of whether NFTs are securities?
It's hard to get to their motives here. I wouldn't say so much sidestepping. I think that this was these allegations were out there for some period of time. And there's a lot of concern as you're dealing with NFTs and crypto and other emerging instruments about abuses. So I could see why the DOJ would really want to bring this sort of case here. To charge it as insider trading, as a sort of securities fraud would require that extra leap of proving the NFT was a security. That's not something they chose to undertake, and I understand why. It doesn't necessarily mean they're sidestepping it. It's a more direct route to get to the fraud without having to undertake the burden of proof of showing this was a security.
So taking a step back, do you think the DOJ's indictment was the correct regulatory response here?
I understand why they felt the need. As I said, it's an emerging area, and the government, whether it's DOJ or the SEC or the CFTC, the regulators are very sensitive to these sort of abuses in these emerging instruments. And that's why you've seen so many SEC cases involving crypto. And for DOJ to get involved here, I do think it's important for the government to get out there and let investors know of the hazards and let those who are abusing the process recognize there are some risks. There are always going to be arguments when you bring the first case of its kind that there's a fairness question. Was this particular defendant aware that he could be facing criminal liability? That's something I'm sure his counsel will raise. There are due process concerns. At the same time, at least according to the indictment, this is an individual who took steps to conceal what he was doing, which I think the government would take the position this is somebody who understood what he was doing, was at least ethically dubious, if not illegal.
Well, you actually preempted my next question. So what are your thoughts on those due process concerns? Do you feel like that's a valid defense?
It's a valid defense. Certainly, if I were defense counsel, it's something I would raise. As you intimated, this question about is there this sidestepping of traditional insider trading where you don't have the security, it does raise legitimate questions about whether this is an appropriate use of government authority and whether this defendant had adequate notice that what he was doing was criminal. And I think that there's some close questions of law. There have been, if you look at Chris Christie and Bridgegate, for example, there was some pushback by the Supreme Court at a similar concept of stealing government or stealing confidential information and whether that's a viable wire fraud theory. So I think that there are arguments here that it's a stretch by the Department of Justice. But again, at the same time, what they did here is not dramatically different in theory from a traditional insider trading case.
All right, let's talk about compliance for a moment. So at the time of the alleged misconduct, do you know whether OpenSea had any type of insider trading policy in place? And has that changed since the allegations came to light?
I don't know, and I don't want to badmouth the company without knowing. I know that there are a lot of concerns that have been talked about concerning the procedures that not just OpenSea, but others in the industry have. So I do think it's a wake-up call, not just for individuals who may be engaged in this sort of activity, but for the platforms, for the brokers, for those who are involved in buying and selling NFTs and other crypto, that there are certainly, even aside from whether they might be liable for this conduct, there is the bad publicity that their name is being dragged out in the press for having allowed this to happen on their platform. So I think it's a wake-up call. It will be interesting to see when the U.S. Attorney's Office or the SEC or the CFTC actually take action against the sort of platform for facilitating or failing to have adequate controls to prevent this sort of conduct.
Do you have advice for other NFT marketplaces that may be grappling with insider trading? It certainly seems like this behavior is pretty common in the NFT space right now.
Yeah, it's like updating what's been going on in the broker dealer investment advisor world on the SEC side for some time, that even where there isn't an underlying violation of the law, the government will go after the broker or the advisor. So for example, you see the SEC will routinely sue investment advisors for not taking care to keep non-public information confidential. Even if they can't prove somebody used that information, engaged in insider trading, they may still go after the advisor or the broker for their controls. So now that NFT platforms and others in the industry are on notice that the government, regardless of whether or not this is deemed a security, is going to be taking some steps here, I think it would be very wise for them to at least put in some procedures. So if the next step, if the next shoe to drop is the government going after the platform, they're able to say, we acted in good faith, even if some misconduct occurred on our platform, we did what a reasonable platform would be expected to do.
Right. So other than the internal controls, which we just addressed, what should folks in the NFT and crypto communities take away from this case?
Well, I think the biggest open question is where we started, is this a security? And in this particular case, the DOJ went without that and decided to bring a wire fraud case. The SEC did not get involved. And I think that there is general consensus that unlike a lot of crypto and tokens, NFTs are probably outside of being a security, but that might be the next thing we see. This may not have been the right case for that, but I have no doubt that the regulators are looking at NFTs, at least in some circumstances, as potentially being securities. The DOJ is not going to get involved in every one of these cases. They've got a pretty broad mission. They're not going to be indicting people left and right for NFT sales, but the SEC and the CFTC, that is something they're heavily involved in. It's a little easier for them to meet a civil burden than a criminal burden. So I'm sure that they are looking actively for a case that crosses the line where it is a security or a commodity where they could get involved and bring a non-criminal case.
Well, it will be interesting to see what happens next. Thank you so much, Marc. I really appreciate you sharing your time and your insights with us today.
Thanks so much for including me.
And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. I will see you next time.